Okay, so this is Chaudhry Abdullah Quaseed, and I wish everyone who's watching this video a good morning, a good afternoon, and good evening, depending on who is watching this video, at what time of the day, and from what part of the world. And I would like to introduce myself a little bit before I get started with the video. I'm an organizational development and performance management consultant for several companies in parallel. And at the same time, I would also like to call myself a coach for life, business, and career. And I have about 26 years of work experience in the field of human resource development and management, and performance management, organizational development and management consultancy, and performance management, which I have mentioned before. And I have had the good fortune of working with many large corporates and some multinationals as well. By large corporates, I refer to local large corporates, and therefore, when I say multinationals, I mean multinationals as in foreign companies. And I am very lucky that I've had about 17 years in the role of division head, bearing titles such as director, executive director, and holding CXO positions by the grace of Almighty God. And I enjoy making videos on various subjects for local as well as international and mixed audiences, and I enjoy stimulating discussions on various subjects and sometimes to challenge the conventional thoughts and ideas on various topics. So today, the topic that I thought it would be interesting to talk about is debunking the myth that the Indian subcontinent was one giant country and that the British came and divided it up into two separate countries. Why do we need to talk about this? It's always a good idea to establish the reason why we need to talk about a subject before we go directly into talking about it. So the reason that we need to talk about this is because we need to correct a long prevailing fallacy and mistaken notion about the history of our subcontinent, and we need to set the record straight. A lot of things can be said which helps people to become popular, especially in politics, and a lot of sentiments are drummed up, and I believe a lot of people's emotions are played with, and there's a lot of manipulation that happens when people talk about history. And there is a tendency for glorifying ourselves and trying to throw all the blame on European invaders, but we do need to sometimes take stock of the reality and try and understand what exactly happened and how it happened and what the real situation was. And it's very important to clarify these things and fallacies because a lot of the times, a lot of very big future historical decisions and people's ideologies will get shaped from a lot of mistakes in history. So we need to be very clear when we're talking about history so that we do not end up misguiding people in the future to create warped history. So let's talk about what Indian subcontinent was like before the British Empire started, before the British took control of it. So if we need to do that, I need to mention that the entire Indian subcontinent, and by Indian subcontinent I mean the present day territories of Pakistan, Kashmir, whole of India, Bangladesh, and the northeastern states of India, which are often called the Seven Sisters now. So this entire region can be said to have been comprised of 10 empires, and it's quite interesting. I mean, the use of the word empire, because empire denotes that more than one country or more than one kingdom or more than one entity, geographical entity, which was supposed to have been sovereign, is several of these supposedly sovereign entities are now being governed by a higher power. And that is actually when the term empire comes into existence. And the fact that there were 10 empires in India before the British came and took over clearly indicates the fact that all of these emperors who were ruling these empires considered that India was actually a continent comprised of numerous countries, and each of them considered themselves to be controlling and governing a collection of those separate countries, which clearly establishes the fact that Indian subcontinent, that is the countries of Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, was not one big giant nation, which is very nicely portrayed in literature and romanticized about, like it was this big Akhand Bharat, but that was not the case. The biggest of these 10 empires was the Mughal Empire, which just before the British were taking over, comprised of approximately 45 to 50% of this entire territory. Once upon a time, the quantity, the percentage of the land area that the Mughal Empire was comprised of had gone up to nearly 80% of this region that I'm talking about. But that was in the late 1600s. Over the first 4 decades of the 1700s, there was a significant decline in the power of the Mughal Empire, and it actually came down to about 45% of the Indian subcontinent. Two of the major areas that came out of the the Mughal Empire was the Bengal Suba and Jammu and Kashmir. Bengal Suba, which is comprised of largely Bangladesh and a significant section of the Seven Sisters and a bit of Sikkim, Darjeeling, the whole of West Bengal, a little bit of Bihar and Orissa. This very large area was at one point a very important and integral part of the Mughal Empire. But from the end of the 1600s, after the reign of Aurangzeb, the Naib Nazims, or the governors of these territories, started to consider themselves to be almost sovereign. They did not pay the taxes to the Mughal Empire as regularly as they were supposed to, and they also reduced the taxation by claiming that there was not much support from the Mughal Empire in running and administering this zone, and that most of the work was having to be done by themselves, and therefore they claimed that they deserved to hold back the majority of the taxes that were being collected, much beyond what they were supposed to hold back. And as a result of that, this region, though by name, was loosely still connected with the Mughal Empire, but in effective reality, they became autonomous kingdoms, or empires as they preferred to call themselves as well, or denote, because there were a lot of kingdoms within these territories that they were managing and governing, and therefore they felt that they could actually call themselves as emperors as well, as empires. And then, so I've talked about the Bengal Suba, I've talked about Kashmir, and then there was the Maratha Empire, which was which comprised major parts of central and western India. Of course, the present Maharashtra, bits of Gujarat. The western side was largely the Maratha Empire, and then there was the Sikh Empire in Punjab, and there was the Ahom Kingdom, which largely comprised of Assam and a major portion of the Seven Sisters, the part that was not occupied under the Bengal Suba, that all of that went under the Ahom Kingdom, the Assamese Empire. And then there were the Rajput states. The Rajput states were comprised of a large number of Rajput kingdoms, and they did not have a central emperor who could claim to be the central authority managing all the Rajput kingdoms. However, they were very united, and they used to take all their decisions together, and they would work as a very cohesive coalition, and they functioned as a single unit. And that is why they would prefer to consider themselves and portray themselves as an empire. But we do not call them an empire as such. We refer to them as a collection of states, and that's why we call them Rajput states. And then there were the Deccan Sultanates, which automatically denotes that there was more than one sultan or sultan who was controlling the Deccan region. But in many of the cases, we found that they would work as a unit as well, as a result of which they were called the Deccan Sultanates and could be referred to as a single empire. And then, of course, there was the Malwa Sultanate as well in central India, and Gujarat Sultanate, which comprised a significant chunk of present-day Gujarat, the portion that had not come under the Maratha Kingdom or the Maratha Empire. One thing that is very interesting is that these territories were also not very well defined or permanently defined, in the sense that everyone was always trying to expand their territories, and therefore they were having conflicts at their borders. And therefore, what we consider to be a great big harmonious Akhand Bharat was actually a continent or a subcontinent or a mini continent constantly embroiled in warfare, and there were constant skirmishes and battles, and there was actually no peace or harmony whatsoever in this entire region. And that is a fact which may not be very appetizing for a lot of people, but that is the truth. Now, let's also talk about the approximate number of kingdoms that were there within each of these independent and sovereign empires, because that would give you an idea of the number of countries as such that this entire region was comprised of. Or, I mean, they were not countries, but they would like to consider themselves like countries. And that is why you would see even today when we talk in Bangla, we often refer to people as like Tomar Desh Kothai, as in like, where is your country? Interestingly, everybody, everyone in Bangladesh is almost, almost everyone in Bangladesh is from Bangladesh, but there is a trend. I mean, we haven't been able to change that part of the language where we always ask, where's your country? The reason is because even a country like Bangladesh, which is not very big, was also divided into numerous little kingdoms, and each of that used to consider themselves to be like a separate country. And that is why we still have the tendency of, when we are talking to people, we don't say which is your jela or which is your district of origin. We end up saying Tomar Desh Kothai, or where's your country. So that kind of gives you the idea that this entire subcontinent was actually not one big united country, but actually a continent comprised of hundreds of small countries. And when the British took over within the first few decades, they did some very extensive census all over the subcontinent, and they registered that there were about 150 languages without even considering the dialects within each of these languages. And generally, it, by the definition of a country or a nation, is generally most people within a country, or the majority of the population of a territory that calls themselves a country or a nation, would be speaking a certain language, the same common language. And the very fact that there were about 150 prevailing languages in this subcontinent kind of gives you an indication of the number of territories and possible countries that there were within this territory or this region. So if we break down, if we take a microscope and go inside each of these kingdoms or empires, then what do we find? We find that the Mughal Empire had about 500 smaller states and jagirs. So they were divided, the Mughal Empire was divided into more than 20 subas, and each suba was given a governor. And then underneath each of these governors, there were lots and lots of jagirdars, and they were territorial governors. And in effect, each of these territories were large enough that they used to consider themselves to be like an independent kingdom. And therefore, the actual number varied in between 500 to 600 because the borders were always a bit amorphous and changing. So the Mughal Empire, which was about 45% of the Indian subcontinent at that time, was comprised of about 500 states and jagirs. So you can imagine how many territories there were. And then the Maratha Empire, which was much smaller and comprised of hardly 15 to 20% of the subcontinent, had 200 chieftaincies, as they would call, or small states or estates. Or you could call them like lordly territories or zamindaris. And then there was the Sikh Empire, and they had about 50 vassal states reporting to the central Sikh emperor or the head of the Sikh kingdom. And then there was the Bengal Suba within the territory that I described, which is the whole of Bangladesh, the entire West Bengal, a little bit of Assam, and then a bit of Orissa and Bihar. In this entire region, just before the British Empire took over, there were about 100 large, small kingdoms or zamindaris, big level 1 zamindaris in this entire region. and each of those zamindaris were like a small state in itself, and that largely comprised approximately 50% of each of those greater districts that we used to have. And that is why each of those territories was almost considered like a separate desh or country. And then the Rajput states, there were about 150 kingdoms within what we would call the Rajput states. That was largely comprised of Rajasthan and several parts of northern and western India. So there were 150 kingdoms that could be put all under the cluster of the name of Rajput states. The Deccan sultanates, though there were 2 or 3 sultans, depending upon how you consider the families being divided and subdivided, and the territories being divided and subdivided in between some brothers and cousins. But under that family and their subfamilies, there were about 100 smaller states who were reporting to the sultans. And Kashmir actually had about 20 smaller states within the entire territory of Jammu and Kashmir. The Malwa Sultanate had 50 kingdoms underneath it, and the Gujarat Sultanate had about 50 to 70, depending on how you define certain family disputes. So in all, there was between 1,300 to 1,400 kingdoms within the Indian subcontinent just before the British took over. And soon after that, after the British took over, there was a lot of re-engineering and redemarcation of territories. And what we had was a 5.1 million square kilometer territory called as British India, and 60% of this was comprised of 16 provinces. So that's about 3 million square kilometers came under the title of provinces, and the average size of a province was about 191,000 square kilometers. In reality, the provinces varied anything in between about 140, 150,000 square kilometer to about 250,000 to 300,000 square kilometer, and the average comes to around 191,000 square kilometers. So that was the average size of a province of India, and 40% of India was comprised of 565 princely states. So around 2 million square kilometer of the Indian subcontinent was divided into 565 kingdoms. If you do the math, then you would find that each of these kingdoms was on an average about 3,500 square kilometers, but that would not be a very correct calculation, because approximately the largest parts of the princely states, there were 13 princely states that comprised the majority of the total area of princely states. And if you take them out of the picture, then the average estates or the princely states were much smaller, between a couple of 100 square kilometers to approximately 2,000 to 3,000 square kilometers, and the average of that was about 1,000 square kilometers. So basically, I can give you a bit of an idea of how big some of these princely states were. The largest was the Jammu and Kashmir princely state, or the kingdom, which was about 222,000 square kilometers. We had Hyderabad following at about 214,000 square kilometers, as big as one of the states now. And then there was the Mysore kingdom coming at about 195,000 square kilometer, Baroda with about 97,000 square kilometer, Gwalior 68,000 square kilometer, Bhopal had about 24,000 square kilometer, Indore kingdom had about 23,000 square kilometer, the Jaipur kingdom had about 68,000 square kilometer, the Travancore kingdom had about 19,000 square kilometer, Bikaner had about 60,000 square kilometer, Patiala had about 15,000 square kilometer, the kingdom of Udaipur had about 41,000 square kilometers, and Jodhpur had about 93,000 square kilometers. So all of these 13 of the largest kingdoms, if you would add them up, would come up to about 1.14 million square kilometers. So 0.86 billion square kilometer was divided between 552 princely states. So that's why I said that the average size of the state was much smaller. And within the provinces, the 16 provinces that we were talking about, there were approximately 3,000 level 1 zamindaris. And these zamindaris were also very large, and many of them, though they were not given the status of an autonomous kingdom, however, in many ways they were given the same kind of importance within the British Empire because of their size, their power, and the wealth, and they were allowed to actually govern the states, their estates, almost like a separate kingdom. And the separate kingdoms, they were known as princely states and autonomous because they were under the British. They did pay a tribute to the British, but they were allowed to run their kingdom in their own way, and they were allowed to exercise their own rules, regulations, and laws, and they would only have a very loose reporting line with the British Empire. And usually the British Empire would keep a cantonment and a few administrative offices over there, but they would largely run that entire kingdom through those princely states. So that was not quite the case within the provinces. In the provinces, there were the districts, and each district had British government, a small miniature government with a court, a police force, and the district commissioner. So all of that was there, but they still did allow a lot of things to be managed and administered by the very large landlords who were known as the level 1 landlords, and under them there were the level 2 landlords. And usually within each of these big estates there were anything between 5 or 10 to 15 to 20 level 2 landlords. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you consider the second tier of landlords, and if you also consider the second tier of lords under the princely states, there were about 7,000 landlords over there. So altogether, there were almost 30,000 territories or estates across what is the Indian subcontinent today. So the reason why this information is relevant and why I'm actually talking about it is because of the fact that I would like to make it very clear that there was really nothing called as like one big united India or Akhand Bharat. Bharat is a word that has definitely been found, and so Hindustan as well in many old texts. But actually, India, the word India was coined by the British as well. And despite the fact that there was like the Hinduism or the Sanatan religion largely prevailed across this region. Religion is one of the factors that is considered in defining a nation. But at the same time, you need to understand that even within the religion, there were numerous factions, and there were and different parts and different kingdoms were given priority to different deities within the religion. So by language, they were separate. By religion, there were differences. Politically, they were definitely separate. It is actually, honestly, if you really go deeper into history, the Mughals had been able to control about 75 to 80% of this entire subcontinent, and prior to them, the Mauryan Empire, Ashoka was a part of the Mauryan Empire, they managed to control more than 85%. So, but even they could not control the entire part of India. Even the Mauryan Empire came up to the Deccan Plateau, and they could not control the southern part of India. And the most interesting thing is that they were able to control portions of Afghanistan, a little bit of Nepal and Bhutan, southern portions of those countries as well. The Mughals, in fact, stretched a little bit into Burma, Myanmar, going almost up to Rangoon, but the entire India was never under a single administrative authority before the British. Therefore, the popular notion that prevails that the British came and butchered one big country into two countries, and they actually injected all the problems and the disunity in the subcontinent is not exactly true. It doesn't really hold water when you dissect the reality very deeply and when you scrutinize history from a very impartial point of view. In fact, it was actually the British who brought, I mean, if you ask me, I would say that the British created a coalition of, at the very least, 526 princely states and 16 provinces, which, if the British had not been there, would also have been divided into, at the very least, 100 to 200 kingdoms as well. So I would say that actually the British came and helped to amalgamate approximately the potentially 7 to 800 or almost 1,000 kingdoms into forming two major countries, which was India and Pakistan. So the entire notion that is often put forward, the narrative that this entire region was one big harmonious country and we were one big happy nation and we would all get along and we would all sing songs together and hold hands and run around trees, is definitely not the picture. The reality is that this was a region that was always in turmoil. People were always fighting wars and battles and skirmishes against one another. And one of the worst things that was happening in this region was the fact that some kingdoms would get together and unite their forces and attack other kingdoms. And a lot of the times, when they would annex that other kingdom, they would divide that among themselves, and therefore each of those kingdoms that attacked would become a little bit bigger. And then when the king, whoever would be running a kingdom, would be having sons and daughters, there was inevitably warfare in between their sons, in between their sons-in-laws and their sons. And a lot of the times, brothers were killing brothers. A lot of the times, sons were killing fathers in order to get control of the territory a bit faster. Sometimes fathers were killing their sons as well because they wanted to hold on to their territories longer. Sons were putting fathers in prison. Fathers were putting sons in prison. Mothers were poisoning fathers. Fathers were poisoning mothers. This entire subcontinent was actually a cauldron of turmoil and violence. So the point I'm trying to make through sharing this and debunking the myth is that it wasn't as rosy a picture as is portrayed. And therefore, I think that a lot of the times certain political groups and certain religious groups and certain people come forward with ideas that maybe this whole place should go back to how it used to be before the British came and butchered us. No, it's a good idea to maybe think about maybe forming something like a European Union or making the SARC come alive. And definitely it would be wonderful to have all the countries of this region work together harmoniously. But that is a vision that we need to have for a nicer future. We do not need to compare it to a past that did not exist, because the rosy picture of the past that we like to portray was, honestly speaking, not there. So that was the point that I tried to make, and I hope that those of you who watched this video enjoyed the information and the analysis, and I would like to invite you to share your thoughts and opinions in the comments. And I'm sure that many of you will agree, many of you will find the information surprising, many of you will disagree, and that's the fun of it. I mean, I don't want or necessarily need to have all of you agree with me. The whole idea is to stimulate discussion, and all of you don't need to even be interacting with me only. You can, those commenting can also be interacting between one another, and that's the entire motive and the objective of making videos like these. So thank you for being with me all this time, and I hope that inshallah we can have a lot more discussions together in videos that I make, and I hope that you will join me in future and definitely be a part of this family of intellectual discourse that I'm trying to create. Thank you so much for joining me.